What you're seeing on your screen are the last known photos of Regina Kay Walters taken by her killer moments before she was murdered. In this video, we delve into the life of Regina, exploring the events that led up to her murder and the subsequent investigation. We explore the emotional turmoil of the people that were affected and the trauma they continue to face. This story is not just a crime story, but a tale of tragedy and the impact it had to leave behind one of the most haunting images in history. Regina Kay Walters was born in Pasadena, Texas on May 5, 1975. She grew up in a very broken home in Texas. Her brother, who was older than her, committed suicide when she was only 6 years old. In 1990, 14-year-old Regina Kay Walters met and fell in love with 18-year-old Ricky Lee Jones. Ricky Jones had been removed from his house along with his siblings in his youth and had grown up in Child Protective Services. Jones had experienced a few run-ins with the law and was already 18 years old when he began dating Regina. The pair appeared to be genuinely in love when they decided to start a new life in Mexico. In February of 1990, the 14-year-old takes and ran away from her home, together with her 18-year-old boyfriend. They decided to head for Mexico. Having no transportation, they made the decision to hitchhike. The teenage lovers were hitchhiking their way out of Houston when a friendly truck driver offered them a lift. Unbeknownst to Regina or Ricky, the man behind the wheel was Robert Ben Rhoades, also known as the truck stop killer. Robert Benjamin Rhoades was born in Council Bluffs, Iowa in 1945. He was raised by his mother in the early years of his life, as his father was a soldier in the United States Army and stationed in West Germany. Rhoades' early life was relatively normal, aside from unspecified social problems in his formative years. He was an active participant in the various extracurricular activities of his attended schools and involved himself with various sports and other programs, including football, wrestling, and choir. Rhoades' criminal involvement during his high school years were only notable for an arrest in 1961 at the age of 16 for tampering with a vehicle, along with an arrest for public fighting in 1962 at the age of 17. After graduating from Thomas Jefferson High School in Council Bluffs in 1964, he joined the Marine Corps. During the same year, his father was arrested for sexually assaulting a 12-year-old girl. He subsequently committed suicide while awaiting trial. A few years later, in 1967, Rhoades was dishonorably discharged from the military for his involvement in a robbery. After his dishonorable discharge from the Marines, he attended college but dropped out. He later attempted to join a law enforcement agency but was rejected, likely for his past dishonorable discharge from the Marine Corps. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, Rhoades married 3 times, having a son with his first wife. Subsequently, he found work in stores, supermarkets, warehouses, and restaurants. Eventually, he became a truck driver. During the 1980s, Rhoades developed interests and hobbies, amongst which included involving himself in the BDSM scene. It was also during this time he verbally, physically, and sexually abused his third wife, Deborah Rhoades. The couple had been married for several years, and according to Deborah, Robert was into unusual sexual practices that she found disturbing. While she reluctantly agreed to participate in group sex with Rhoades, Deborah didn't want to integrate elements of bondage into their marriage. When she was ill, even hospitalized with lupus at one point, Rhoades enjoyed seeing her suffer, and he found his wife's pain sexually arousing. Rhoades preyed on hitchhikers and truck stop sex workers starting in the 1970s. His first confirmed victims were 28-year-old Douglas Diskowski and his wife, 24-year-old Patricia Walsh, a couple he had picked up as hitchhikers in January 1990 near El Paso, Texas. Walsh and Diskowski had recently gotten married and they decided to travel from their hometown in Seattle, Washington, to Georgia. They were both deeply religious and they had intended to preach about Christianity when they reached the East Coast. However, shortly after they accepted a ride from Rhoades, the middle-aged trucker shot Ziskowski and dumped a 28-year-old corpse near a Texas highway. Rhoades then held Walsh captive for approximately 1 week, repeatedly torturing and abusing the young woman, before shooting her to death and disposing of a dead body in central Utah. Sadly, while the remains of both Ziskowski and Walsh were discovered shortly after they were murdered, it took years before both of them could be identified and returned back to their families. Almost a month after Walsh's death, he abducted an 18-year-old victim, Shanna Holtz, who escaped and informed the police. When Rhoades was detained, the victim declined to press charges, feeling that she would not be believed, despite extensive evidence. In her statement to the police, she stated that she did not see any good in filing charges. It was later asserted that she was fearful of Rhoades after enduring 2 weeks in his truck. Rhoades had converted his truck into his own personal torture chamber where he kept women, sometimes for weeks, torturing and sexually assaulting them. After Regina Kay Walters and Ricky entered his truck, Rhoades killed Ricky so he could abduct Regina and keep her to abuse at his will. Regina spent close to a month in the dungeon-like compartment, which was accessible from both front seats. She endured weeks of torture before Rhoades shaved a private area and gave her a final haircut. Driving her to an abandoned barn, he took one of the most disturbing photos of all time, showing a defenseless Regina moments before her death. In addition to physical and psychological torture, Rhoades cruelly involved Regina's father. Anonymously calling his home and office 1 month after she vanished, he said, "I made some changes. I cut her hair." He then admitted to having left her in the barn and hung up when her father asked if she was still alive. Regina Kay Walters was already dead. Her lifeless body would only be found when a farmer searched the property before having it burnt down. Authorities would later recover photographs from his home that depicted Regina and other victims in stressed positions and visible horror. The images, showing differing hair lengths and various bruises on Regina, would reveal that she had been held captive for an extended period of time. The wire she had been strangled with had been twisted many times beyond the point needed for death. In the early morning of April 1, 1990, Trooper Mike Miller of the Arizona Highway Patrol found the truck with its hazard lights on at the side of I-10 near Casa Grande, Arizona. When he investigated inside the truck, he discovered a nude woman, later identified as Kathleen Vine, handcuffed and screaming. There was also a male present who identified himself as the truck driver. After failing to talk himself out of the situation, Rhoades was arrested and charged with aggravated assault, sexual assault, and unlawful imprisonment. He was left handcuffed in Miller's patrol car, but nearly escaped. After she was rescued from Robert Ben Rhoades' vehicle, the woman told law enforcement that she had met the middle-aged man at a truck stop and he had agreed to give her a ride to her destination. However, she fell asleep shortly after climbing into the vehicle, and when she awoke, she found Rhoades had placed restraints around her wrists and ankles. To her shock and horror, she realized Rhoades had converted the cab of his truck into a mobile torture chamber, equipped with chains, shackles, and handcuffs to help him restrain his victims. He even had a horse's bridle, which he had placed around the young woman's neck to immobilize and control her. Rhoades whipped her repeatedly, causing red welts to appear all over her chest and back, and he had a briefcase in his truck, filled with toys and tools he used to sadistically torture and abuse the hitchhiker. An FBI agent who reviewed the contents of the briefcase claimed it was one of the most refined kits he had ever seen, leading him to conclude that Rhoades had been torturing and abusing his victims for a very long time. The hitchhiker also told police that while Rhoades was subjecting her to horrific acts of abuse and torture, he told her his nickname was Whips and Chains. Officers later discovered that this was a name Rhoades, who had been involved in the BDSM scene for years, went by when he used his CB radio to communicate with his fellow truckers. Law enforcement eventually learned that in addition to BDSM, he was a swinger who regularly had sexual liaisons with other married people in his hometown of Houston, Texas. After Rhoades was arrested for kidnapping and assaulting the 27-year-old woman, the arresting detective, Rick Barnhart, was able to make a connection to the Houston case and noticed a pattern stretching over the course of at least 5 months. In executing a search warrant for Rhoades' home, they discovered a number of disturbing items, including makeup, woman's clothing, a blood-covered towel, bondage magazines, whips, handcuffs, and Regina's notebook with her father's number written inside it. Authorities also found several photographs, including pictures of Regina Kay Walters that appeared to have been taken in an abandoned Illinois barn shortly before she was killed. In some of the images, the 14-year-old is naked, and law enforcement realized that Rhoades had shaved off Regina's pubic hair. In other photos, she is clothed, wearing a black dress and high heels. She appears extremely frightened and upset. Also present were photos of Walsh, whose body was discovered later that October. Among the photos recovered at the apartment was an image of an unidentified woman captured as she was entering his truck. On the 26th of May 1990, the partial skeleton of Ricky Lee Jones was found near Houghton. He had been shot in the head. In 1994, Rhoades was convicted of the first-degree murder of Regina Kay Walters and sentenced to life without parole. In 2005, he was extradited to Utah to be tried for the death of Candace Walsh and Douglas Siskowski. However, in accordance with the victims' families' request, the charges were dropped in 2006 so that they would not be required to testify more than once for both states, and he was returned to prison. Rhoades later was extradited to Texas for the murder of Regina and Ricky, where Rhoades, in exchange for dropping the death penalty, pleaded guilty to their deaths and received a second life sentence. Special Agent Mark Young has studied Robert Ben Rhoades' crimes, and he believes that the tracker may have reached the height of his abductions and killings in early 1990, not long before he was apprehended by police. During the many years Rhoades worked as a truck driver, Rhoades traveled all over the United States. After reviewing his work records, authorities determined that the truck driver had regularly visited more than 20 different states, making him a possible suspect in a number of unsolved murders. He continues serving his life without parole sentence at a maximum security correctional center in Chester, Illinois. During the summer of 1985, a 15-year-old girl suffered the most terrifying moments of her life after she hitched a ride with a truck driver who later threatened to kill her at knife point, before she made a daring escape. 6 weeks prior, Vanessa Veselka had run away from a New York home with her 21-year-old boyfriend. After they parted ways, she was left alone with nothing but $60. At a truck stop heading south of I-95, she was picked up by a man who, after searching for clues 27 years later, she believes was serial killer Robert Ben Rhoades. Returning to the scenes of her terrifying memories, Vanessa, the author of critically acclaimed novel Zazen, relived the moments in an essay for GQ magazine. She flew to Austin, Texas to meet with 2 retired FBI men, Special Agent Mark Young and Robert F. Lee, who had both worked on Regina Kay Walters' case. From reading about Rhoades, Vanessa knew he targeted hitchhikers rather than prostitutes, who frequently went missing during the 80s at truck stops. Young pulled out one last picture and gave it to her. The photo was of a woman, possibly Native American. She was on the end of the road with Regina Walters. However, the incidences were 5 years apart from one another. She's shown sitting in Rhoades' truck wearing a grey hoodie. Her eyes are partly closed, as if she's stoned or sleepy. Rhoades must have just picked her up because he hasn't cut her hair yet. No one knew who she was. In 2015, a Thunderchild First Nation woman made a chilling discovery online that could help police in 2 countries discover more about a convicted serial killer's activities. Pamela Milliken was browsing through Facebook when she came upon a post asking for help identifying a young Native woman in a photo left in the semi-truck of the truck stop killer, Robert Ben Rhoades. Milliken said she knew right away it was her in the photo. She was going to find her brother in Winnipeg. She started hitchhiking from Thunderchild First Nation in Saskatchewan in the spring of 1985. After a series of successful rides, she met up with a semi-truck driver she identifies as Rhoades in the town of Vice City just outside of Regina. She was walking a ways and it was getting dark. She stuck her hand out and waited for someone to pick her up when a flat-nosed, white semi-truck stopped on the highway and she went running after it. Once she opened up the door and looked at him, he told her to get in. Just as Milliken was turning around to climb onto the passenger seat, the driver took her photo. When she asked what the photo was for, he said, "Well, I'm going to take your pic. If you rip me off, I can tell the cops that you stole from me." She and the driver, who introduced himself as Robert, chatted on the way. He told her he was going to Florida and he wanted her to go with him. At one point, he pointed at the sign on the dashboard that said, "Cash, grass, or ass, no rides for free." She neither had money nor pot, so she knew which one it would be. She and the driver had consensual sex in the back of the truck. She was later dropped off without harm in Winnipeg, at the bus depot. Fast forward 30 years and she came across the Facebook post. She knew it was her in the photo, but she didn't have a photo of herself from that time to prove to anyone. However, she later recalled seeing her photo on the wall of her niece's house from that time period. Milliken then reached out to the FBI. While Rhoades is serving life in prison, investigators believe he killed up to 50 people between 1975 and 1990. Ultimately, all that's left is an aging convict and some of the scariest photos ever entered into evidence.